When you need to focus on building, do you want to get bogged down by your database? MongoDB is an intuitive, flexible document database that lets you get to building. MongoDB's document model is a natural way to represent data so you can focus on what matters. MongoDB Atlas is the best way to use MongoDB. It's a global cloud database service that gives you all of the developer productivity of MongoDB, plus the added simplicity of a fully managed database service. You can get started free with MongoDB Atlas at mongodb.com/atlas. Hi, this is Scott Hansel, and this is another episode of Hansel Minute. Today I'm talking with Teri Radichel about her book, Cybersecurity for Executives in the Age of the Cloud. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
I appreciate it. So when I think about cybersecurity, I honestly think about my own personal information being stolen, and I wonder if that's what executives think about. Is that their primary concern, that they're going to wake up one morning and it's a breach today?
I'm not really sure, but I know they should be concerned about it based on the statistics last year. And I think that we know now that it's not just the CISO's job, because we've been seeing CEOs and testifying in front of Congress and dealing with lawsuits. So I'm really hopeful that more executives want to know about cybersecurity and make really good cybersecurity decisions. So that's what I'm trying to help with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. While you were in the middle of writing the book, there was a report that came that indicated that breaches are up 33% over the previous year. Why are breaches so top of mind right now? Why has that become the thing to steal data?
So there may be a number of factors, and I can't say for sure, but there are, different breach notification laws for one thing. There are also people moving to the cloud, and I sort of speculate in my book about how the cloud may have contributed to this. I'm a believer that the cloud can actually help you be more secure when used properly. But if you rush out there and you don't understand the controls, it can actually have the opposite effect. And then we just, criminals have figured out this is, easier than some other types of crime. You can just sit on your computer and hack into things. So I think we just have more and more people getting into that space on that side as well.
Yeah. You point out that in most cases, it's not the fault of the cloud providers. It's really rather the way that the organization moved to the cloud, which is interesting.
Yes, definitely. I think that, I experienced this working for a large financial institution, and there was a lot of, hey, we have to figure out how to do this with a big company and get to the cloud. And it felt like we lost some of the traditional controls in some cases that we had previously. I think Capital One did a pretty good job. We had 3-tier networking and things like this that I think are lacking at a lot of other companies. We have protections in the development environment, so a developer could not put a database directly on the internet. But you're seeing so many breaches where someone just exposed all their data to the internet directly. And that's just a misconfiguration. You have people doing these things who potentially weren't doing them before, or don't fully understand the implications of those actions, or they just made a mistake and there's no sort of guardrails in place to stop that. So I think like when I was a developer, I couldn't do that. There was no way I could put a database on the internet. It was just not possible before the cloud.
And still, there's so many. Yeah, that's a good point. It's the cloud lets you get things onto the internet quickly. Therefore, it lets you do things dumb more quickly. Putting a VM out with a remote desktop port wide open, or leaving default passwords. It's allowed companies to accelerate. So then, if they're doing things insecurely, they've done that accelerated.
Definitely, I think that the issue there too is some things are harder in the cloud, but you can still do them. I always say you just do them differently. And so there's been this sort of notion of we don't have a perimeter anymore. And I say, yes, you do. You have a perimeter. It's just distributed, and you still have to understand all those access points. But for some people, it's hard, so we're just not going to do it anymore. And that doesn't really work. And I think that's another factor when you have people who are not used to implementing those things, and they think these controls are just a bother sometimes. So I think that training and understanding of those things is really important.
It seems also that I'm surprised that the rise of software-based networking hasn't allowed people to do better. I mean, we can have, before I would have my front end, my business logic, my database, and I'd have separate racks, and I'd physically see the plugs, and I would, but now with software-based networking, you can have private VPNs between layers, and you can really use the cloud to limit exposure, to limit least privilege and things like that. But how are we educating people about these things? I don't think that the average org just naively picks up a VM and throws it into the cloud.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues. I definitely saw the push towards, push back initially against cloud. And it's part of why I got into cloud security specifically, because I knew that security was going to be the blocker, but I also saw huge potential in cloud. And I also worked at a company that made firewalls and security equipment. So I saw, the old school way of doing it versus the ability, like you said, to really programmatically create your networking. But I think what happened is you had people jumping into cloud before the security teams got there, before the networking teams got there, because they thought it was a huge risk. And they didn't have the network training. And it's very complicated. I built, all the VPCs initially, not the VPCs, but all the networking for 11,000 developers at Capital One. And it's very complicated to set that all up correctly. We had some good design patterns, and then we had to figure some stuff out along the way. And sometimes, developers have this mindset where they just want to go out and build things, and they're not focused on those sort of nuances with networking and security. So I think we have to kind of get back to where we have people who understand both sides working together a little bit more closely in some cases.
Yeah, you point out in your book that some vendors push the idea that identity is more important and good authentication is more important than firewalls and routers, which seems kind of silly to me, why you would abandon one well-known, understood way to keep things secure for a largely nascent and emerging thing in the space of identity.
Yes, I really think that's something I really highlight in my class that I do not agree with. And I have people who used to work at certain organizations in my class, and by the end they're like, yes, defense in depth. So they agreed with me once I walked through all the reasons why you still want to have those network controls. I think it's just not a full understanding of why those controls are in place and what they do for you. It's not just blocking a port, it's structuring a network such that you can see the attacks on your network and there's things you can see in the network and stop in the network before they ever get to your identity, which is really a risky point for people to be at attacking. So, there's reasons we have both. And I think some people may just not understand those reasons.
One of the things that I liked about your book was that you are directing this towards technical, but not so technical that it's overwhelming. Like, just when I think you're about to get into a buzzword, you're really clear. You open up 3-letter acronyms and you walk people through like how a typical breach works using pretty accessible language. Was that a really conscious choice? I mean, you're writing this for security focused people, but not necessarily security experts.
It definitely was. I think I mentioned near the end, it's something I've talked about in a lot of my presentations. I used to work on very complex financial systems. And if executives can understand these very complex financial systems, like, dividend processing and sweep accounts and cost basis and all these other things, they can definitely understand basic cybersecurity. And the other thing that I want to do is, cybersecurity seemed to me when I started to be shrouded in secrecy. When I had my first breach, there was no one to help me, and I had to figure everything out myself. It was many years ago, super hard. And I just think, wow, if I had just had a little bit of basic security knowledge, it would have been so much easier. So there's kind of all those things wrapped up together where I just want to get the basic knowledge out there so people can understand what the risks are and a little bit about what to do about them.
You also seem to be a big fan of being conscious about what's connected to what. And you say that it all starts with an internet connection, right? Like the most secure machine is a machine that's not connected. But you also pointed out that like some malware uses VPNs of their own. I didn't realize that a malware could make its own VPN to try to hide traffic from you while you're looking for traffic.
Yeah, they definitely can. There's for people who understand really deep security, you're getting into the packets and you're looking at the individual packets and the really detailed information going over the internet through your various security devices. And when the attackers encrypt that, you can't see it. And that becomes a problem. And so there's a lot of things we can find out without going that deep, but it is one of the things they're trying to do as a defensive mechanism to try to hide what they're doing. So it's a good idea to be aware of, what's supposed to be on your network and what looks like it shouldn't be there.
Hmm. You're a big proponent of the idea of defense in depth. You don't feel that there's a silver bullet or one way, or this is what we should all put all the wood behind this arrow. You say we should definitely focus on all of these different things. But then you talk about going down at the traffic and the inspecting the packets. How do you balance the low level where I'm looking at a single packet on the net to try to figure out a breach versus the high level stuff that an executive needs to understand as they make strategic decisions from day to day?
I think it's important in some, kind of the way I summarized the book in the end. We need better metrics to bring this up to a high level to know what the risk is. So there will be people at the low level. There's a particular breach. They're very trained in incident handling, and they're looking at it and they're trying to figure out what it is, how to stop it, or maybe they're doing threat hunting, and that's really important. But it's also important at the high level to somehow be able to make our systems able to provide high level metrics that work for executives to say, okay, we have a risk. Maybe it's in a certain department, someone's not following the rules, and we need to go take care of that. Or we have X number of systems that are misconfigured, don't have MFA. Let's go figure out how to fix that. So I think there's just different levels that we need to look at there. And I think that a lot of the breaches are caused by sort of basic security hygiene. That's what a lot of people like to say. So we can fix those things first before we start worrying about the threat hunting and the packets in some companies. Some companies are more advanced than that, but there's a lot of companies where that basic security hygiene still, we could take a look at that and try to fix it.
Mm-hmm. When I was going through the table of contents, sometimes you read a book linearly, and sometimes you say, I'm going to look at that chapter. That looks good. So I'm going through your table of contents, and I see trust is overrated. And I'm like, this is some clickbait. So I turn to that page, and you literally start with the first sentence. You say, I wrote this catchy title to grab your attention. So you got me. I dived right into the book, and I went straight to the trust is overrated chapter. But what is the point of that wonderful clickbait title?
So I think that everyone wants to be trusted, right? And they're like, you don't let me do this thing, you don't trust me. And that's not what it's about. People make mistakes. People will do things that they don't realize as a risk. So it's not about trust. It's about trying to set up guardrails and security mechanisms to prevent mistakes in a lot of cases, and to sort of weed out a lot of the things that can go wrong, the basic things that can go wrong. This is a big issue in the cloud because developers say, well, security doesn't trust us, and they want to go build all these things, and they don't understand why we need to block the bad ports. Why do we need a Bastion host? Why do we need a VPN? And so that chapter kind of goes into, why do we need these things? Why do we block out these bad things? It also talks about, this issue of trust where people want to be trusted, and this kind of back and forth you have. And I think a lot of security people that I know got into security because of a breach or because they saw what could happen. And so they want to protect other people, but the other people don't understand it's a problem. And so they're like, you just don't trust us. But it's more than that. So that's kind of what the chapter is about, but it's also about software-defined networking and zero trust and all that as well. So it's kind of a big chapter focused on that kind of core topic in security.
Yeah, I mean, there's the people trust, and you point out the natural predilection to want to trust people wholeheartedly. And of course, we know that the easiest way into a network isn't getting into the network itself; it's just social. What's the word for social engineering your way, right? You're more likely to just drop a USB key in the garage in the parking lot and make your way onto the network. But you also call out how practices and best practices and recommendations say that we should define trusted and untrusted networks in the environment. That's been the guidance for a decade, 2 decades. And you point out that, connections within the network should be safe. But more and more I hear people saying that we should just assume that everything is compromised and the bad guys are living in your house.
Actually, that's the opposite. I actually talk about how nothing is safe and why you should trust nothing in the network. So that's, the zero trust model. And I think it applies not only to networking, it also applies to, identity management. For example, if people are setting up 2 APIs, which are ways that systems can talk to each other, you might think, well, this is our internal system talking to our other internal system, so we don't need to authenticate or authorize that other system. We know it's ours. But the problem is when the attackers breach that system, they will use that as leverage to get somewhere else in your network. So this whole concept is don't trust anything, whether it's internal or external, and have the protections in place between these systems so that the malware can't jump around. And a good example of that is the NotPetya malware, which came out and it took down a lot of organizations with ransomware. The way that malware worked is it got in through a software download, and then it would basically spread through all the machines in the organization. If those machines could not talk to each other in the network, that would not have been possible.
Protect your apps from reverse engineering and tampering with Preemptive, the makers of Dotfuscator. Dotfuscator has been in the box with Microsoft Visual Studio since 2003. Dotfuscator's long history as the first .NET obfuscator means that Preemptive has extensive support for all .NET platforms, including Xamarin, .NET Core, and build environments like Azure DevOps. Whether you're protecting a mature app that's facing new risks or a new app that you haven't released yet, Dotfuscator has you covered. Visit preemptive.com/Hanselminutes for your professional grade trial. One of the breaches that really blew my mind, and I actually had to read it a couple of times, and I'm still not quite sure I understand how this happened, was the Target breach. I remember when it happened in the news, you're saying that they got in through their heating and ventilation vendor and bounced over into the point of sale?
So what they did was there's a misconception they broke into the HVAC system. They actually broke into they got some malware through a phishing attack onto that vendor's computer. Mm-hmm. And it's speculated that they may have known that vendor worked with Target because of something that was published online. Mm-hmm. So then they were able to get the credentials for the Target vendor management system off that and use it from that computer. And a lot of big companies will have vendor management systems where, I have to use them when I work for a big company where I have to set my business up inside of them and give them all my information so I can work with them. So it was a system like that. And once they got into that system with those credentials, they found flaws on the internal side of that system. This is one of the reasons why I tell people you always want to pen test your internal and your external portions of your web applications. And then from there, they were able to get to, from one machine to another. It's a very complex breach. I wrote a white paper on it and it's in my book. But they basically jumped all over the network and they found all sorts of flaws to then pivot and exfiltrate that data.
The idea that those things would be connected, like first when I saw they were in the HVAC, I'm like, oh, are they on the same network? But like you pointed out, they're using the relationship between systems and the business relationship between vendors and the centralized vendor management system. It's not like it is on TV where, we're on the same subnet. The HVAC is on the same subnet as the point of sale.
Exactly. It can make it very complicated. That was a very interesting breach. I just happened to start my master's program at SANS at the minute that breach took off. And I wanted to really dig into a breach and find out what happened. It happened to be a super complex and interesting breach. They really took a lot of steps to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. You also call out the idea of these internet exposed ports. People still start with everything open and then shut things off, as opposed to starting with everything shut off and opening just the absolute minimum. And even then, often they don't think about the ins versus the outs. These are exponential increases in risk when they start exposing things to the outside.
Yeah, so I take a look in the book at that sort of thing. If you think about it, if you think about statistics, you don't have to be in cybersecurity to understand that the more ports you have open, the more things you have running exposed to the internet, the more chances you're giving an attacker, because they will go out and scan every single thing that is exposed to the internet. They will find it. If you put it out there and don't tell anyone, they'll still find it. And I talk about ways they can do that in the book. And then they'll try to attack it. They'll see if it's not up to date. They'll look for other sort of exploits, everything from VPNs to websites, anything running on the internet. So if you just think about putting those things in a private network and only exposing what you absolutely need to expose, you just reduce your risk by having less for them to attack. And sure, firewalls aren't perfect, but I always say a closed port is still a closed port. There's nothing there for them to get at. They still might be able to trick and find a way through those things that are still open, but you still have limited what you have to worry about.
Yeah, I've explained that to students and non-technical spouse as, how many windows and doors does your house have, and how many people do you want jiggling the locks and jiggling the doorknob? Just don't have a door if you can avoid it.
Exactly.
You also call out the importance from the perspective of the executive to have policies, which is what people should or should not do. But then the difficult part of keeping those policies up to date. You might put a lot of work into a policy, and then 4 years later, that policy just isn't the way people think about security anymore.
So this is where I really am a fan of the cloud if used correctly, because there are a lot of companies doing this. They weren't when I started, but now they are. They are using the programmatic aspects of the cloud to enforce their security policies. And you can't do everything, but you can do a lot of automation to enforce your compliance with either you have external compliance or internal compliance, or the rules that you need to follow in your company. And if those are leveraged, you can prevent a lot of those problems. There are cloud native tools that will check your configuration, and if it gets out of kilter, they will tell you, hey, you have a problem here. We don't think this is a good security configuration. In some cases, you can even roll it back to what it was supposed to be. So these are very powerful tools to help create those policies and keep them in check. You need to have people creating them that understand security. So I know a lot of developers want to go out and create these things, but there are people in security that have very deep knowledge. I think we need to make sure they're still in there helping create these rules and these policies, and keeping them in line with what the organization wants.
Yeah, I think that one could say that might be the thing about the cloud that's the most interesting. We can talk about, elasticity. You can scale the cloud. We can talk about being able to be programmatic. You can tell the cloud what to do and write scripts around it. But the idea that a security policy can now go from a Word document, which stops no one,
Yes.
to a series of compliance rules, right? Word documents have no teeth, but a Word document that has an automated script and process behind it can allow like an Azure or an AWS to go and have a security score, which means that there's a dashboard, right? I could show that security score, that dashboard, that compliance number, that health number to an executive, and impose those processes upon the network.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things that I looked at when I looked at cloud. And I thought, wow, this is really powerful. You can deploy things in an automated manner. And I actually saw security benefits for this reason and others. I see the ability to dynamically create the network with much more granular rule sets than is possible in traditional firewalls. I know they're getting better, with the software-defined networking. I think that's actually pushed by the cloud providers. But there's just a lot of power there to programmatically set up your rules and your policies, and also monitor it and fix it if something's wrong.
And you actually propose a pretty straightforward kind of loop. I work in the developer community, so we think about what's called the developer's inner loop. It's like write some code, compile it, test it, hit refresh, and then loop as fast as you can. And you propose that same kind of policy enforcement. Understand what's causing the breach, make a policy, measure the gaps, rinse, repeat. But then you call out that you've never really seen a holistic cybersecurity risk reporting system like you propose in all the places that you've worked or consulted. Yeah. What's preventing that?
I'm not necessarily the person working in that department, but sure. The things I have seen, I felt like there's some piecemeal things going on, and I feel like we can leverage these deployment systems and these monitoring systems to create a more holistic report that gives us data that is specifically will lead to a breach. We know the things that cause breaches based on various reports like the Verizon data breach report and others. We can see, the things that are causing these breaches and track them in the configurations now. And why is this not happening? I think it's starting to. I think there's a convergence of a lot of things right now. When I took my security classes, there was a lot of command line, scripty kind of things. And so I wrote some cloud code that way just because I knew security people would be comfortable with that. And then you have developers writing whole cloud architectures and doing things like serverless. And I think I've already seen a lot of security teams using these serverless technologies to react to security events. I just feel like it's slowly converging where you have, I've had I definitely have come from a software background. When I do pen testing, I leverage that a lot. And I've heard some other pen testing companies say we only hire people who have software skills now.
Mm-hmm.
We have security teams doing the same. We still need the people with the, lot of long time experience, but you've got other people coming in who have that software background is kind of converging.
Mm-hmm. So what do you do when you have like the perfect policy, everyone's solid, everyone agrees on it, this is the right thing to do, except this organization wants an exception to the policy?
So there will always be exceptions. And I've seen this backfire where someone comes in and creates sort of a draconian policy and rule, and they automatically shut systems off. And inevitably that will go, like all the way up to the CEO or someone high up, and they'll complain and everything will get shut down. So I always warn people about this in my class. When you create your policies, plan for exceptions, and make sure that you have a process that's not going to take, forever. It's obviously easier if they follow the policies and the rules that you have set up, but have a way to handle those exceptions where you can say, okay, we're going to create an exception. We know who did it. We know how long it's going to be in place. It's tracked. So if you have a security problem related to it, you can go back and say, well, see, we try to tell you, not to point fingers, but to say, here's why this is happening. Let's go fix it. So, just tracking that. The other thing is I talk about cumulative risk. So you might have this little exception and that little exception. And pretty soon you've got a whole lot of exceptions. You don't even remember what they all are. And now you have a huge amount of risk versus that one little exception on its own. So I'm a big fan of more tracking of that.
I'm also a fan of exceptions that, like you said, have a timeout. I'm seeing also when people need to temporarily remote into a machine, that more and more cloud systems are saying, all right, I'll open this port for you for 30 minutes. And it'll auto close. Or we'll do an exception. It's a 90-day exception, just like certificates expiring, but you just make the expiration, you make the closing of this extremely aggressive. And maybe something breaks, but better to accidentally slam the door on someone's finger than to just leave the door open for everyone.
Yeah, actually, that's one of my favorite features in Azure is that just-in-time access. I was trying to create something like that. There's something on AWS called an AWS button where you can push it and it can trigger an action in the cloud. And so I was using that button to open and close the network just for fun. And then the just-in-time access came out and I was like, wow, that's really cool. Because it just automatically, you can make a request, someone can approve it, and then it automatically shuts down. So yeah, I think those ideas are coming. I think they're possible because of the automated nature of the cloud. And I think there's a lot more we can do in that area.
Yeah, but knowing that those things exist is the challenge, right? Like if you're an executive, automation is important, but you may not have plugged into your brain yet that aspects of cybersecurity can be automated like that.
Yeah, I think this is where we need the traditional security people who know what they want to happen, and the developers who may have creative ideas to say, hey, well, what if we did it this new way? So definitely I had people tell me, you can't do packet capture in the cloud. And I was like, yes, you can. It's just different. So I wrote a paper about it. So I think bringing those two worlds together is hugely important to move this forward.
Well, and the irony, of course, is that while we're saying that automation in the security space is nascent on the corporate side, the attackers, that's how they do things. It's all about, do a thing. Okay, now let's do it N times. Let's automate. The attackers are using automation, so why shouldn't we be using it as well?
Yeah, definitely. We've got worms. We've had worms forever. I think something I talk about at the end of the book, where they're kind of automating, getting from one computer to the next. Stagers, loaders, all these things they use to get software onto the computer and then follow up and add more. That's all automation. They can't sit at that desk. They have to use automation to get that malware onto those systems. So yeah, you could say they're better at than the defenders at this point. Hopefully we can change that.
So the defenders, we want to keep them out, but what do we do when they're in the network and we also have to run a business? They're in your network, but I still have to keep selling stuff. Do I just push the oh crap button and shut it all down and hide out, or how do we get them out?
So this is where understanding incident response becomes really important, and planning in advance. You have your disaster recovery plan, and for things like ransomware, how are you going to recover if you need to recover from a backup? So you want to do some planning in advance. You want to have that incident response plan. There are whole books on this, huge topic. People are very well versed and trained in this. It's not something you want your developers doing on the side. If you have a large company, maybe if it's a small company, you have no choice. But it's a big topic. So you have to understand, how long do you want to let it run? Do you want to look at it? Do you want to contain it? Do you want to just eradicate it immediately? And these are decisions you have to make based on, do you want to potentially prosecute someone? Do you understand what happened so that you can get rid of it completely and make sure it doesn't come back? So there are just many, many factors there in terms of making those decisions. It's not really a quick answer, I guess.
I worry sometimes, though, that security is like, eat well and work out, and 30 years from now, you won't die. People want, I want an answer, I want a pill, I want a thing I can solve right now. And you're saying, do all of these things and probably good stuff will happen to you in the future. And I think as humans, we really are not very, very good at that.
So I think we need to start somewhere. We just need to, try to do the right things, small steps. I just read this book called Atomic Habits, and it's all about how taking small steps can lead to good habits in the long run. You don't have to go out and start, running 10 miles a day to get ready for a marathon. You start small and you work up to it. And it has a lot of strategies in there for doing that. And I put it in the book because I thought it was a great example of just starting to take the steps to reduce the chances that you'll get attacked. And the reality is a lot of companies will still get attacked, but hopefully it will have less impact on their business. It will cost less. They'll have less records stolen if they have implemented the things to monitor and watch for these breaches, and they've limited the damage they can do through all these sort of segregation techniques and other things. So it all kind of adds up to reducing the impact of breaches if one should occur. Hopefully they don't occur at all if you do all the right things, but it's going to be better off than if you don't do anything at all.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Teri Radichel, for chatting with me today about your book, Cybersecurity for Executives in the Age of Cloud. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was very nice to be on the show. Thanks.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.